Empty shelves stretch like graveyards across America's heartland. The fluorescent lights of abandoned pharmacies flicker over rows of vacant medicine cabinets. What was once the world's most sophisticated supply chain network has become a monument to broken promises and shattered dreams. This is not a story about trade wars or economic theory. This is about Susan Martinez, a 58-year-old pharmacist in Toledo, Ohio, who has watched her life's work crumble into dust. Susan's pharmacy has been serving the Riverside neighborhood for 32 years. The same families who bought their first baby formula here now come desperately searching for blood pressure medication that simply doesn't exist. The executive order that promised to bring manufacturing back to America has instead created a medical wasteland where basic antibiotics have become more precious than gold. Susan stares at her empty shelves, knowing that Mr. Johnson, her 74-year-old diabetic customer, will walk through that door in 2 hours asking for insulin that she cannot provide. The mathematics of catastrophe began 18 months ago when the administration signed the American Manufacturing Revival Act. Every essential item, from pharmaceutical compounds to electronic components, from automotive parts to food processing equipment, would be manufactured 100% on American soil within 24 months. The tariff wall that followed wasn't just high. It was a fortress designed to make foreign goods economically impossible. The architects of this policy believed they were rebuilding America's industrial backbone. Instead, they had severed the arteries that kept the nation's economy alive. 70% of retail shelves across the Midwest now stand empty. The pharmaceutical shortage has reached crisis levels, with hospitals rationing basic medications like morphine and penicillin. Emergency rooms have become triage centers not for trauma victims, but for patients whose chronic conditions have become acute due to medication shortages. The supply chain that took decades to build across continents has been reduced to rubble in less than 2 years. The human cost reveals itself in devastating detail. Maria Santos, a mother of 3 in Detroit, drives 200 miles every weekend searching for her daughter's asthma inhaler. The inhaler that once cost $15 now sells for $300 on the black market, when it can be found at all. Auto mechanic Jim Thompson in Milwaukee has a parking lot full of broken-down vehicles that he cannot repair because the computer chips and sensors they need are manufactured in Taiwan and South Korea, countries now effectively cut off from American commerce. The ripple effects cascade through every sector of society. Restaurants close because they cannot source ingredients. Hospitals postpone surgeries because they lack essential equipment. Manufacturing plants that were supposed to benefit from reshoring sit idle because they cannot obtain the raw materials and components needed for production. The very factories that were meant to replace foreign suppliers cannot operate without foreign-made machinery and parts. American manufacturers find themselves trapped in an impossible paradox. To build the domestic capacity to replace foreign suppliers, they need equipment, materials, and components that are primarily manufactured overseas. The Ford plant in Kentucky cannot produce vehicles because it lacks semiconductor chips from Asia. The pharmaceutical company in New Jersey cannot manufacture antibiotics because it cannot import the chemical precursors from India. The solar panel factory in Arizona cannot operate because it needs rare earth materials from China. The global economy has not waited for America to rebuild its industrial capacity. While American shelves empty and American factories struggle, other nations have formed new trade partnerships that exclude the United States entirely. The European Union has strengthened its ties with Asian manufacturers. Latin American countries have pivoted their supply chains toward China and India. Canada has become a conduit for goods that once flowed directly to American consumers, creating a complex smuggling network that operates in broad daylight. In the pharmaceutical sector, the crisis has reached apocalyptic proportions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, chief of cardiology at St. Mary's Hospital in Cleveland, describes her daily routine as a form of medical rationing that would have been unimaginable just 2 years ago. She decides which heart attack patients receive medication based not on medical need, but on availability. The medication shortages have created a 2-tier healthcare system where the wealthy can afford black market pharmaceuticals while the poor and elderly face life-threatening gaps in their treatment. The black market economy that has emerged represents a fundamental breakdown of American commerce. Underground networks smuggle everything from children's fever reducers to automotive brake pads. Prices have inflated to astronomical levels, with simple items like phone chargers selling for 50 times their original cost. The very policy designed to protect American workers has created a criminal economy that operates outside all regulation and safety standards. Susan Martinez reflects on the transformation of her profession from healer to bearer of bad news. Each morning, she unlocks the door to her pharmacy knowing that she will have to look customers in the eye and tell them that the medications they need to survive are not available. The elderly man who needs his heart medication, the young mother whose child has an ear infection, the construction worker whose back injury requires pain management, all have become casualties of a policy that prioritized ideology over human need. The psychological toll on healthcare workers has been immense. Pharmacists report anxiety levels comparable to wartime medics. Nurses break down in hospital corridors, overwhelmed by their inability to provide basic care. Doctors make house calls not to provide treatment, but to explain why treatment is no longer available. The healthcare system that once represented the pinnacle of American medical achievement has been reduced to a humanitarian crisis. Manufacturing workers, the supposed beneficiaries of reshoring policies, find themselves unemployed as their factories cannot operate without foreign components. The General Motors plant in Ohio laid off 8,000 workers because it cannot source the electronic systems needed for modern vehicles. The Boeing facility in Seattle has suspended production because it cannot obtain the specialized materials required for aircraft manufacturing. The very workers who were promised secure employment have become victims of economic nationalism. The agriculture sector faces its own unique challenges as food processing equipment breaks down without available replacement parts. Meat processing plants operate at reduced capacity because they cannot maintain their machinery. Grain elevators sit idle because their computerized systems require components that are no longer available. The American farmer, traditionally the backbone of the nation's food security, now struggles to get products to market. Small businesses across America tell similar stories of survival and adaptation. The corner hardware store that once prided itself on having every tool and fastener now displays empty pegboards and apologetic signs. The local electronics repair shop has closed because replacement parts are impossible to obtain. The family-owned restaurant has simplified its menu to only items that can be sourced domestically, often at prohibitive cost. The infrastructure implications extend far beyond consumer goods. Municipal water treatment plants cannot obtain the chemicals needed for purification. Traffic signals fail because replacement bulbs and electronic components are unavailable. Schools postpone the start of the academic year because they cannot obtain computers and educational equipment. The basic systems that keep American society functioning have been compromised by the disruption of global supply chains. The winter of 2026 brought more than just snow to the American heartland. It brought the final collapse of the most ambitious economic experiment in modern history. The Made in America initiative, once hailed as the return of American manufacturing dominance, had become the gravestone of American prosperity. The empty factories that were supposed to hum with renewed production instead stood as monuments to economic miscalculation on a scale that historians would later compare to the Great Depression. Regional hospitals across the Midwest began implementing what they euphemistically called comfort care protocols. Dr. Sarah Chun, emergency room director at Memorial Hospital in Kansas City, no longer bothers to sugarcoat the reality for her staff. Without basic medications like epinephrine for allergic reactions, insulin for diabetics, and antibiotics for infections, the hospital has become a hospice for conditions that were once easily treatable. The medical supply shortage has forced American healthcare back to 19th century standards of care, where a simple bacterial infection can become a death sentence. The pharmaceutical crisis extends far beyond individual suffering to systemic healthcare collapse. Veterinary clinics cannot obtain antibiotics for livestock, leading to disease outbreaks that threaten food security. Pet owners watch helplessly as their animals suffer from conditions that were once routine to treat. The cascade effect touches every living creature in America, from the family dog to the dairy cows that provide milk for children who can no longer find formula on store shelves. Agricultural communities that have sustained American food production for generations face extinction. The Johnsons, a farming family in Iowa whose roots trace back 5 generations, watch their combined harvesters sit broken in the field because they cannot obtain a simple hydraulic seal manufactured in Germany. Their corn crop, enough to feed thousands, rots in the field while Americans in cities face food shortages. The irony is devastating. A nation that once fed the world cannot feed itself because it cannot fix its own farming equipment. The automotive industry, once the pride of American manufacturing, has become a graveyard of incomplete vehicles. The Ford plant in Dearborn produces cars without air conditioning systems because the refrigerant components come from Mexico. General Motors assembly lines roll out vehicles missing crucial safety features because the sensors are manufactured in Japan. These incomplete vehicles sit in vast parking lots, automotive sculptures that represent billions in lost investment and thousands of unemployed workers. The electronics sector reveals the true complexity of modern manufacturing. Apple's attempt to source iPhone components entirely from American suppliers has resulted in phones that cost $8,000 and perform like devices from the 1990s. The rare earth elements needed for modern electronics simply do not exist in sufficient quantities in American mines. Silicon Valley, once the epicenter of global innovation, has become a collection of empty office buildings and abandoned server farms. The energy sector faces its own apocalypse. Solar panel installations have stopped completely because the panels require rare earth materials from China. Wind turbines stand motionless not because there is no wind, but because the replacement parts needed for maintenance are manufactured overseas. The green energy revolution that was supposed to power America's future has been strangled by economic nationalism. Coal plants that were scheduled for retirement have been forced back into service, burning fuel that creates more pollution than the energy it produces. The construction industry has ground to a halt as builders cannot obtain basic materials. Steel beams sit in warehouses because the bolts to connect them are manufactured in Taiwan. Concrete cannot be poured because the additives that ensure proper curing come from European chemical companies. Housing projects that were supposed to address America's affordability crisis have become half-built monuments to supply chain failure. Homeless encampments grow larger each day as construction projects remain frozen in bureaucratic and logistical purgatory. The telecommunications infrastructure that connects American society has begun to fray. Cell phone towers fail because replacement equipment is unavailable. Internet service providers ration bandwidth because they cannot obtain the fiber optic cables needed to expand capacity. The digital economy that once drove American prosperity has been reduced to a shadow of its former self, operating on equipment that grows more obsolete and unreliable with each passing day. Educational institutions face their own crisis as schools cannot obtain computers, laboratory equipment, or even basic supplies like paper and pencils. The University of Michigan has suspended its engineering program because it cannot obtain the equipment needed for hands-on learning. High schools across the country have eliminated chemistry and biology courses because they cannot source the materials needed for experiments. An entire generation of American students is being educated using methods that would have been outdated 50 years ago. The defense industry confronts a national security nightmare. Military contractors cannot obtain the sophisticated components needed for advanced weapons systems. The Pentagon has been forced to extend the service life of aging equipment because replacement parts are unavailable. America's military superiority, built on technological advantage, erodes daily as other nations continue to advance while American defense capabilities stagnate. The airline industry has become a symbol of American decline. Commercial flights are canceled not because of weather or mechanical problems, but because aircraft cannot be maintained. Replacement parts for Boeing and Airbus aircraft come from suppliers around the world, suppliers that are now cut off by trade policies. American airports, once bustling hubs of global commerce, have become echo chambers where the sound of footsteps on empty concourses replaces the roar of jet engines. The retail sector has transformed into a landscape of empty storefronts and going out of business signs. Walmart, once the symbol of American retail dominance, has closed thousands of stores because it cannot stock merchandise. Target has eliminated entire departments because the products simply do not exist. The American consumer, once the driving force of the global economy, has been reduced to a hunter-gatherer searching for basic necessities in a landscape of artificial scarcity. The The financial implications extend far beyond individual hardship to threaten the stability of American currency. The dollar, once the world's reserve currency, has lost 30% of its value as other nations create alternative payment systems that exclude American participation. The New York Stock Exchange has suspended trading in dozens of sectors because the companies have no viable business model without access to global supply chains. Retirement accounts that once represented financial security have evaporated as the American economy contracts at a rate not seen since the 1930s. International relations have suffered irreparable damage as former allies create new partnerships that exclude the United States. The European Union has strengthened trade ties with Asia, creating a new economic axis that bypasses American markets. Mexico and Canada have formed closer relationships with China and India, treating the United States as an unreliable trading partner. American diplomats find themselves isolated at international conferences, representing a nation that has voluntarily removed itself from the global community. The psychological impact on American society has been profound and lasting. Mental health services report unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression as Americans confront the reality that their government has sacrificed their well-being for ideological purity. Suicide rates have increased dramatically, particularly among elderly Americans who cannot obtain life-sustaining medications. The social fabric that once held American communities together has been torn apart by economic desperation and political recrimination. The black market economy that emerged from the supply chain collapse has become a parallel economic system that operates outside legal oversight. Criminal organizations have evolved from drug trafficking to importing everyday necessities. The same networks that once smuggled narcotics now smuggle children's medicine and automotive parts. Law enforcement, struggling with their own equipment shortages, cannot effectively combat these organizations. The rule of law that once distinguished America from failed states has been compromised by the government's inability to provide basic services. Regional disparities have created a patchwork of economic survival strategies. States along the Canadian and Mexican borders have developed informal trade relationships that circumvent federal policy. California has negotiated separate agreements with Pacific Rim nations, creating a de facto independent trade policy. Texas has strengthened its ties with Mexico, treating the Rio Grande as a commercial highway rather than a political boundary. The United States has begun to fragment into regional economic zones that operate with minimal federal coordination. The environmental consequences of reshoring have been catastrophic. Without access to efficient foreign manufacturing, American companies have been forced to rely on older, more polluting production methods. The air quality in manufacturing regions has deteriorated to levels not seen since the 1970s. Water supplies have been contaminated by industrial processes that lack modern filtration systems. The environmental progress of the past 50 years has been reversed in the name of economic nationalism. The cultural impact reaches into every aspect of American life. Museums cannot obtain materials for exhibits. Orchestras cannot replace broken instruments. Artists cannot source materials for their work. The cultural institutions that once made America a beacon of creativity and innovation have been reduced to preserving what exists rather than creating what could be. The American cultural export that once dominated global entertainment has been replaced by productions from other nations that have maintained their place in the global community. The technological sector, once America's greatest competitive advantage, has been reduced to reverse engineering products from other countries. Silicon Valley companies that once led global innovation now struggle to maintain products that were designed 5 years ago. The brain drain that has resulted from economic isolation has seen American engineers and scientists immigrate to countries where they can pursue their research without artificial constraints. The startup ecosystem that once drove American entrepreneurship has collapsed as venture capital dries up and regulatory uncertainty makes investment impossible. The agricultural sector faces long-term consequences that extend beyond immediate equipment failures. Soil degradation has accelerated because farmers cannot obtain the specialized fertilizers and pesticides needed for sustainable agriculture. Crop yields have declined to levels not seen since the 1950s. The American farmer, once the most productive in the world, now struggles to match the output of developing nations that have maintained access to modern agricultural technology. The housing market has become a reflection of broader economic malaise. Home values have collapsed as buyers cannot obtain mortgages and builders cannot complete construction projects. The American dream of homeownership has been replaced by the nightmare of foreclosure and homelessness. Entire neighborhoods have been abandoned as residents flee to regions where basic services remain available. The healthcare system has evolved into a tiered structure where access depends not on medical need, but on financial resources and geographic location. The wealthy have access to private medical facilities that maintain stockpiles of essential medications. The poor and middle class rely on overwhelmed public hospitals that operate with 19th-century limitations. The Hippocratic oath to first, do no harm, has been replaced by the harsh reality of medical rationing in a country that once boasted the world's most advanced healthcare system. The educational system has been forced to adapt to a reality where technology and modern teaching materials are unavailable. Teachers use chalkboards and textbooks that are decades old. Students learn chemistry through theoretical discussion rather than hands-on experiments. The American education system that once produced the world's leading scientists and engineers now struggles to provide basic literacy and numeracy skills. The military faces a crisis of readiness as equipment ages without replacement and recruitment suffers from young Americans who lack the technical skills needed for modern warfare. The volunteer military that once attracted the best and brightest has been reduced to accepting recruits who might have been rejected in previous decades. America's military superiority, built on technological advantage and professional excellence, erodes daily as other nations continue to modernize while American forces make do with aging equipment. The social contract between government and citizens has been broken as the state proves unable to provide basic services. The legitimacy of democratic institutions has been questioned as elected officials defend policies that have clearly failed to achieve their stated objectives. The American political system, once admired around the world, has become a cautionary tale of how ideology can triumph over pragmatism with devastating consequences. The final collapse came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet desperation of a nation that had lost its way. The Made in America initiative, conceived as a return to greatness, had become the instrument of American decline. The empty factories, the bare shelves, the broken infrastructure, and the suffering citizens all bore witness to the folly of economic nationalism in an interconnected world. America had chosen isolation over integration, ideology over pragmatism, and political rhetoric over economic reality. The cost of that choice would be measured not in dollars or statistics, but in the lives of ordinary Americans who had trusted their government to protect their interests and instead found themselves abandoned to face the consequences of policies that had sacrificed their future for political theater.